The news at 5:45 with Fiona Armstrong.
America's next president, George Bush, starts choosing his team. Lawson tells Labour opposition layoff over pensions. Ulster policewomen win £1 million in sex discrimination case. And successfully separated, a Siamese twin goes home with mum. Good evening. The next American president, George Bush, has promised a brand new team to put his stamp on the White House and the country. He's already appointed James Baker to take over from George Shultz as Secretary of State, the president's right-hand man on foreign affairs and superpower arms talks. Mr. Bush won all across the United States with 54% of the popular vote to 46% for Michael Dukakis. More important, 40 of the 50 states went to the Republicans. Now, with victory so firmly behind him, Mr. Bush has pledged that America will be kinder and gentler at home, but strong abroad.
This was a bruising campaign, and as the president-elect and his future First Lady emerged at the Republican victory celebration, the theme was reconciliation. Mr. Bush had been accused by his opponents of negative, even dirty tactics, but he said he'd received what he called a gracious and genuinely friendly phone call from Michael Dukakis.
A campaign is a disagreement, and disagreements divide, but an election is a decision. And decisions clear the way for harmony and peace.
But as the Republicans celebrate 4 more years in the White House, they face stern challenges. Ronald Reagan was adept at settling differences with his political opponents. Mr. Bush may not find that so easy. By the time he emerged this morning with campaign chairman James Baker, he'd made his first presidential decision, naming Mr. Baker, the former Treasury Secretary, as his Secretary of State.
Thank you all.
And at his first news conference as president-elect, he said Mr. Baker would move quickly to lay the groundwork for a Bush-Gorbachev summit.
I've never supported meetings just for the sake of having a meeting. You want some progress to take place.
Despite the promptness of this first press conference, Mr. Bush had little to offer by way of specific policy statements, but he did make it clear his administration would not merely be an extension of President Reagan's.
There will be, as I think I indicated, a major turnover, but some people at various levels may be asked to remain. But as I have stated over the campaign, I think there's something to be said for reinvigorating the process with new people.
Mr. Bush will be received by Ronald Reagan here in Washington later today. He'll have 2 months to shape his own administration and to develop a strategy for dealing with those Democrats in Congress who are just itching for a fight. Tim Ewart, ITN at the White House.
The Democrat camp in Boston last night was racked with a sense of what could have been. Michael Dukakis had once seemed to have the presidency in his hands. Now, within an hour of the polls closing in California, here he was to hand it to George Bush.
Just a few minutes ago, I called Vice President Bush and congratulated him on his victory. And I know I speak for all of you and for all the American people when I say that he will be our president, and we'll work with him. This nation faces major challenges ahead, and we must work together.
The Democrats regarded him as a decent and clean candidate, but it was only in the final days that he produced the fight that might have defeated Bush had it come earlier. The party itself savored Senate and congressional victory, accentuated by his running mate Lloyd Benson's Senate win in Texas. Those wins will make life tough for George Bush. But with Michael Dukakis, for the 5th time in 24 years, the Democrat Party's quest for the White House had ended in failure. Jon Snow, ITN, Boston.
Mrs. Thatcher will be the first Western leader to meet the president-elect when she visits the United States next week. She was on the phone first thing this morning to offer Mr. Bush her warmest congratulations.
This morning, Mrs. Thatcher rang Mr. Bush. Next week, she'll go to see him. Clearly, she intends to be as close to him as she was to Mr. Reagan.
We each have our own style. I've known George Bush's style for a very long time, and we get on very well together.
But would he be easier to handle than Mr. Reagan?
You don't handle United States presidents. You offer them your support for policies in which you both believe.
Mrs Thatcher's delight is not echoed by all at Westminster. The Labour leader's congratulations were conditional.
Well, I congratulate President Bush and wish him well in office, especially in dealing with two major challenges. The first, to follow in the footsteps of Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev with their disarmament initiatives, and secondly, to apply an economic policy that will succeed in reducing America's huge trade deficit.
I would have preferred Mr. Dukakis in terms of what he stood for in politics, and I think he would have stood also to do things that are necessary on the world scene, open up the whole situation with South Africa, perhaps have a much more progressive attitude towards the Soviet Union.
The opposition here is unhappy most of all because this is another victory for the right. Peter Allen, ITN, Westminster.
The big finance houses in the city and on Wall Street have made it clear who they want in the White House. But news of George Bush's election was greeted with a slide for the dollar as dealers focused again on America's economic problems.
We have got a fax going out this morning to the clients saying, read my lips, sell dollars.
And in New York this afternoon, the dollar has continued to fall. There'll be no honeymoon for George Bush as far as the markets are concerned. They're worried he'll be unable to cope with the huge budget deficit.
Reagan was quite good as the communicator and had the public support to be able to fight and get his policies pushed through an opposition Congress. Whether or not Bush can, I think, has the market very worried. And there are some major questions to be answered, specifically whether or not we can cut this U.S. budget deficit.
The financial markets want swift action from the new president on the deficit. Until this happens, confidence in the dollar and shares will be very fragile. Hugh Pym, ITN, the city.
After a campaign that dwelt strongly on the values of family life, the spotlight is now falling on the two First Ladies. Barbara Bush and Marilyn Quayle have both had a major part to play in their husbands' success.
Barbara Bush says that life as America's new First Lady won't be all that different. After all, she's had 8 years to practice. With 5 children and 8 grandchildren, the White House will become much more of a family home than under the Reagans, whose relationships with their children were often strained. Although she clearly didn't enjoy it, she campaigned hard enough during '88 to ensure her husband's victory.
I could do much better than that, but not in front of cameras.
Together for 43 years, theirs is one of the longest-lasting political marriages in Washington.
He's the most caring, warmest, loving person you've ever known.
Even if he does find it hard to express that emotion in public.
With feeling, with demonstrable emotion, the next First Lady, United States. Come on up, sweetie pie, come on up.
At last night's vice presidential victory party, Den Quayle thanked everybody.
You did it, we did it, and George Bush did it.
But many people say Marilyn Quayle is the real power behind her husband. The couple met and married at law school, where she graduated with a much better degree. She writes his speeches, advises him on every political move. Here, pulling him away when the talkative senator won't leave an interview that she believes has gone on far too long.
I'd be glad to. Right this way, sir. I'd be glad to.
Ken Rees, ITN, New York.
Chancellor Nigel Lawson went back on the attack today over reports that he wants to means test a wide range of social security benefits. He accused the newspapers of scare stories and said that Labour repeated allegations they knew to be untrue. But Labour have tabled a motion expressing their lack of confidence in the Chancellor.
Labour say the Chancellor's explanation in the House of Commons of his meeting with journalists was completely inadequate. They want Nigel Lawson to account for himself again. But in a letter today, the Chancellor accused Labour of scaremongering with their claims that he was going to means test pensions. So would Neil Kinnock's case against Nigel Lawson stand up in a court of law?
The jury would then have to decide, and the jury that has to decide, of course, is Parliament and the British public. We simply want to ensure that the star witness gets the opportunity to give his version of events and to make his plea of not guilty, and then people can draw their own conclusions.
Tonight, the journalists who were briefed confidentially by the Chancellor last Friday are insisting Nigel Lawson's remarks on the government's plans to overhaul benefits were absolutely clear.
I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that the Chancellor was not talking or steering us towards some new benefit just on top of the existing ordinary social security structure. He was talking about a change in that very structure and not about one new benefit, which is his line about what that briefing was all about.
This evening at the Commons, some Conservative MPs are hinting the Chancellor now needs to lay the matter to rest in a full debate, and government whips acknowledge time will have to be given if a full censure motion is pressed. Julie Hall, ITN, Westminster.
More than 300 former police women in Northern Ireland have won almost £1 million damages in a sex discrimination case against the IUC. The IUC Chief Constable, Sir John Herman, had said they couldn't carry weapons, and that had meant they couldn't carry out full police duties.
The women reservists had argued that they had been deprived of work because of sex discrimination by IUC Chief Constable Sir John Herman. Most of the women are part-time reservists whose hours have been cut back. Many contracts for full-timers weren't renewed. Sir John's policy prevents women officers from performing the same duties as their male colleagues. This, the highest ever UK award for sex discrimination against women, has a history going back 6 years. At the heart of the issue is the Chief Constable's refusal to allow women to receive firearms training. The result of this, men have guns, women don't. 5 female officers have been killed in terrorist attacks since 1975, and the Police Federation says most women get part-time pay for full-time risk.
We cannot have better people than our girls here in the force. They take the same risks as the men. They carry out their duties as efficiently and as effectively as they do.
This evening, there was no indication that the policy had changed. The IUC and Police Authority declined to comment. Andrew Simmons, ITN, Belfast.
MPs have launched an angry Commons attack on the government's plans to introduce top-up loans for students. The students will have to pay back the loans after they finish their studies. Labour says it'll frighten people away from higher education, but Education Secretary Kenneth Baker strongly defended the scheme.
What I am saying is that students should invest in their own future. And we are providing extra facilities for them to do that by the way of loans. And we're the only country in the world that doesn't have some form of student top-up loans together with grants. I'm not stopping the grant system, but the levels of grants will be frozen. And in addition to that, students will have access to extra resources.
The government has announced it's pressing ahead with identity cards for soccer fans. From next season, it'll be a criminal offence to try to get into a soccer ground without a proper ID. But critics say that plans for a computer blacklist of hooligans are illegal.
All 92 league clubs will now have to have turnstiles like Luton's, which only admit fans with ID cards. Computers in each ground linked to a central one will stop known troublemakers. Football's objections on grounds of cost look to have been overcome by this Lincoln firm who could install the whole system free in return for using the computer list for direct mailing. But wasn't that an infringement of civil liberties?
Go and talk to the people who have to bolt up their windows and in the past had to shut down pubs, and to the people who are detracted from going about their normal business on a Saturday afternoon, who have to face hooligans around them, who have to face being beaten up when they go to football. These are restrictions on civil liberties.
Fans arriving for 4th Division Leyton Orient's game last night are mostly in the club's existing membership scheme, but they fear their average 3,000 gate could be even further reduced.
We're talking about photographs and plastic cards and £5 to £10. I would think there'll be a lot of resistance to that initially.
Football's other objection, the scheme will simply mean the hooligans transferring their activities from the grounds to the streets while small clubs die. Giles Smith, ITN Sport, Leyton.
One of the Siamese twins, separated after a series of operations by doctors in South Africa, went home today. Mapu, which means gift, is now 2 years old. Her sister will have to stay in hospital a little longer.
23 months after medical staff gave little hope for the Matebela twins, they sang a joyous farewell to Mother Sophie and her stronger daughter, Mpho, whose name means gift. But Mpanyana, little gift, is still too weak to leave hospital and will need further daily therapy. So it was a parting which was also painful for both mother and daughter. But doctors said it was time for Mpho and her mother to start a normal life. The twins were born joined at the head, but after a series of delicate and historic operations, surgeons succeeded 6 months ago in separating them. So now one at least was able to enter a brand new donated home to a rapturous welcome from the township children. Donated too, the furniture which was cheered into the house, where little Po, who still requires therapy and treatment, began her new life, though it may be some months yet before her twin sister can join her. For Mponyana, an emotional day ended as it began, back in a ward in Soweto's hospital. Kevin Dunn, ITN, Johannesburg.
And the main story again, George Bush has promised a brand new team in the White House. James Baker will take over from George Shultz as Secretary of State. Finally, the last cruel touch for Michael Dukakis. It was curtains for him at home and mothballs for him at Madame Tussauds in London. The Dukakis waxwork has been sidelined as Mr. Bush takes centre stage.
But he's the one who's won.
Yeah,
It was never like this, even on the campaign trail. Aides pushing you around, photographers shouting orders.
What an angle.
Then, when they finally get you into position, having to watch them fight for the picture. And who is this man stealing the limelight? Madame Tussauds say he's George Bush, or at least his spitting image. The shock was all too much for Dukakis. In the end, he was unceremoniously returned to the stockroom for an informal welcome. As for the revelations that President Bush is really the Queen's 13th cousin, twice removed, the people of Messing in Essex, supposedly the Bush hometown, were celebrating today. Special cakes were baked, and the owners of the local pub now want to change its name to the George Bush. They've even got a framed letter from the man himself. And in case you hadn't heard the news, the election result lit up Piccadilly Circus today with a truly electric likeness of the president-elect.
And that's all from us, from everyone on the news at 5:45. A very good evening. See you tomorrow.